In 1901, a school teacher vanished somewhere along the cold, winding roads of the Missouri Ozarks. 7 letters were sent to her, and 7 letters went unanswered. No one paused to ask why. No one questioned the empty schoolhouse or the quiet that settled over Piney Hollow, like snow falling in silence. Everyone assumed she had simply arrived late, or taken ill, or perhaps wandered into the forest and would return. Everyone, that is, except one man. I am Silus Webb, 62 years old, postmaster of Howell County, keeper of every letter, every stamp, every record that passed through my hands. And I will tell you what I discovered. What I discovered was a pattern, a series of events so deliberate, so carefully hidden, that for years it went unnoticed. A string of names that ended abruptly, letters that never reached their destinations, trunks buried, wells capped, and a silence that was never meant to be broken. I learned that sometimes evil does not shout. Sometimes it waits, patient, quiet, confident that no one is looking, confident that those who do look will turn away. It began with the letters. 7 letters addressed to a young woman named Ada Kern, stacked neatly in the post office, waiting for someone to deliver them to a schoolhouse she was never to see. Her father's penmanship from St. Louis, full of encouragement and hope, reached into the cold valley only to be met with absence. Her replies, filled with the excitement of a new position, of children she would teach, vanished, as if the world had swallowed her whole. And in those missing replies, in the spaces where ink should have answered ink, a story waited. A story of men who collected women like the Mlin brothers collected furs. I traced the entries in the ledger, each name and date etched in black India ink that refused to fade. Sarah Dill, 1896. Constance Healy, 1898. Josephine Dale, 1899. Margaret Frost, 1900. And now, Ada Kern, 1901. Women traveling alone, passing through Piney Hollow, routed through the property of 2 brothers, Virgil and Ezra Mlin, who lived quietly, spoke little, and appeared to follow no law beyond their own. And in the quiet of the post office, surrounded by the ticking of the stove and the weight of snow against the window, I realized the truth. The ledger did not lie. The absence of these women was not a coincidence, and the men responsible would not answer questions willingly. I am Silus Webb. I have carried news through rain, through snow, through war. I have known chaos, and I have known order, but nothing had prepared me for the task that lay before me in the winter of 1901. In the hollow where men and women passed like shadows in a story, no one dared speak aloud. Because sometimes the truth waits in a ledger, in letters, in dates and deliveries. And sometimes, if you are willing to see it, that truth will lead you to a place where fear has taken root, and where silence is the most dangerous companion of all. After seeing those letters, I could not ignore them. 7 unanswered letters, each one a small testament to hope unfulfilled, to trust misplaced. The ledger in my hands told the story of a young woman delivered to a place she should have never stepped into alone. The Mlin property, deep in Piney Hollow, 5 miles from the nearest neighbor. 2 brothers who had lived quietly, exchanging furs and flour, keeping to themselves in ways that did not invite scrutiny. Men whose existence was a question, and whose silence was an answer. I had processed her mail since September. Cheerful letters from her father, full of instructions, advice, and care. Replies from her, brimming with optimism and a sense of duty, the kind a young woman carries when she believes in the goodness of the world. And then, after October 10th, nothing. Nothing came back. Nothing arrived. Only the cold, quiet stack of letters that had gathered in the post office, like snow accumulating in corners untouched, unnoticed. I ran my finger down the ledger entries for that October day. 1 trunk, 1 carpet bag, delivered to her name, care of the Mlin farm. I remembered the wagon driver mentioning dropping her off just after dawn. I remembered assuming she would walk the remaining mile to the schoolhouse, as one would, unaware that the valley itself was about to swallow her whole. I cross-referenced the records with school board minutes. The schoolhouse remained empty. No applicant had arrived. No explanation was recorded. And the letters kept coming. Her father asking, worried, unanswered. Something in the regularity of the post office, in the rhythm of my own life as its keeper, told me this was wrong. There was no hint of danger on the surface, no screams to pierce the valley, no neighbors to notice anything amiss. Yet the ledger did not lie. It had always told the truth, and now it was screaming at me in black ink on yellowing paper. I began to dig through the older records, going backward through years, cross-referencing names, routes, deliveries. It took hours, the lamplight flickering across ink-stained pages, shadows shifting in the corners as the winter wind pressed against the windows. And then the pattern emerged. Sarah Dill, 1896, schoolteacher, vanished after her mail was routed to the Mlin farm. Constance Healy, 1898, governor's appointee, disappeared on the same path. Josephine Dale, traveling nurse, gone in 1899. And now Ada Kern, same route, same silence, same emptiness left in letters never delivered, hopes never returned. 4 women over 6 years, each crossing the threshold of Piney Hollow, and never reappearing, each a name in my ledger of absence. I could not rely on the law. Sheriff Clayton Hayes had served Howell County for decades. He believed the world could be explained without digging too deep, and he would not risk the machinery of his office for suspicion alone. Evidence, bodies, witnesses, those were the only things that mattered to him. But I had the ledger, I had the pattern, and I had a certainty that rose in me like a tide, relentless and demanding. Someone would answer for this, and if the law refused, then I would see it done myself. The snow piled against the post office window that December, and I stood alone, letters clutched in hand, thinking of each young woman, imagining the hope in her eyes as she stepped off the wagon, step by step, toward her fate, toward a place where no one had been willing to follow. The ledger showed the way. The mail wagon had delivered her, and the hollow awaited, silent and patient. I would ride there at first light, alone, because sometimes the work of justice belongs to no one but the one willing to see, and to count the names, and to follow the ink to the darkness. The next morning, the cold had sharpened everything. The snow lay in unbroken drifts along the roads, and the sky was a pale, hard gray that made the world feel smaller, tighter, and heavier. I saddled a borrowed mare, the leather stiff from frost, and tucked my coat close around me, letters pressed into my breast pocket like a weight of duty. I carried my journal, my revolver, and the certainty that what I was about to do would be seen by no one but the trees, the hills, and the wind. The road to Piney Hollow was narrow and winding, flanked on both sides by oak and pine. The trees leaned close, their branches black against the gray sky, and the snow muffled every sound except the creak of leather and the soft beat of hooves. I rode slowly, memorizing every bend, every hidden dip in the road, aware that in this hollow, the land itself could hide what men wanted to keep secret. I thought of the women, Sarah Dill, Constance Healy, Josephine Dale, Margaret Frost, and now Ada Kern, and the hope they carried in their hearts, as they moved through this same valley, trusting strangers, trusting a path, trusting the world. When I first glimpsed the Mlin property, it seemed almost ordinary. A low cabin, smoke curling from the chimney, a barn to the left, weathered and grey. The place was neat in the way of men who lived by their own rules and expected no one's approval. There were no signs of women having lived there. No laundry hung to dry, no garden in summer bloom, nothing that spoke of the lives they had taken. Only the quiet, the snow, and the sense that this place had been waiting, patiently, for decades, for the world to stop asking questions. The barn door hung half open, and the line of traps gleamed dull steel in the winter light, organized with care. Bundles of furs lay stacked in corners, tied with cord. Everything had its place. Everything spoke of men who understood order. But as I dismounted and tied my mare to a post near the porch, I realized the place was also a trap. The calm, the routine, the quiet. They were weapons, wielded to keep eyes and hands away from the truths hidden within these walls. A man appeared at the cabin door, thin, bearded, with eyes like creek water. Virgil Mlin, according to the county records, though his movements suggested he had lived far longer than his years. He spoke softly, deliberately, in a voice that poured over stone, careful with every syllable. Polite, almost welcoming, as though expecting a visitor who might stumble and fall into their carefully maintained illusion. I introduced myself. I asked about Ada Kern, described her arrival, the mail wagon, the distance to the schoolhouse. Virgil's head shook slowly, eyes never blinking. He had never seen a schoolteacher, never seen anyone. The driver must have been mistaken. No woman had set foot here, in memory of either brother. Inside the cabin, coats hung on pegs. Heavy wool, different colors, like those a traveler might carry. I asked about them. Virgil said they had belonged to their mother, dead 10 years. Waste was a sin, wool lasted, questions were nobody's business. His voice carried the confidence of someone who had lied so often it had become truth. I knew then that the answers I sought would not be offered freely. I asked to see the barn. Virgil hesitated only a heartbeat, then called his brother. Ezra Mlin appeared in the doorway, larger, silent, expressionless, eyes fixed on me with the intensity of a man trained to watch, to wait. Together they led the way across the yard. The smell of leather and curing furs hit me, sharp and clean, masking yet another presence. And in the far corner, half hidden by shadows, a trunk, brass fittings caked in dried mud, the letters of Ada Kern's name etched faintly across the plate. I stood before it, the winter wind cutting across the yard, the brothers watching, and I knew I had found the first tangible proof of what I suspected. Yet even then, the men were calm, measured, confident in their ability to obscure the truth. Virgil explained the trunk away. Ezra remained silent, a silent sentinel to the lies that had built this place. I made no accusations. I did not rush. I left the Mlin property that day, the wind at my back, their eyes following me, marking me as someone who had seen and remembered. I returned to town that afternoon, heart steady but mind racing. I had seen enough to know that the ledger, the letters, the vanished women, they all converged here. I had seen the first pieces of evidence, subtle, quiet, yet undeniable if one chose to see them, and I knew, as the sun dipped behind the ridges of the Ozarks, that I would return. Because evil, even when quiet and hidden, cannot escape the eyes of one who refuses to look away. Over the next days, I returned to the post office, poring over every ledger I could reach, Each delivery, each trunk, each piece of correspondence was a thread, and I followed them back through years of winter, spring, summer, and fall. Names emerged like stars in the night sky: Sarah Dill, Constance Healy, Josephine Dale, Margaret Frost, and finally, Ada Kern. 5 women over 8 years, all traveling alone, all routed care of the Mlin property, all gone silent. I traced each route with my finger across the old maps, noting the bends in the road, the ridges and hollows, the streams that cut through the timber. I saw where a wagon would leave a traveler at the Mlin farm, and where she would vanish. The patterns were impossible to ignore. No one else had looked closely, but the ledger was indisputable. I knew then that evil in Piney Hollow had been patient, methodical, and that it had waited for years without challenge. I began to plan my next move. I could not confront the law with speculation alone. Sheriff Hayes had already made his position clear. Without bodies, witnesses, or proof, nothing would be done. But the land does not lie, and the ledger had shown me where to look. I would watch the property. I would note every movement, every light, every sound that could reveal the truth. That night, I rode back to Piney Hollow, mounted on a borrowed mare, cloaked in wool, rifle across my lap, letters pressed in my coat. The wind cut through the hollows like a knife, and snow crunched beneath the hooves. As I reached the property line, I tied the mare where she could pick her way safely in the dark, and I moved forward on foot, each step measured, each breath visible in the cold night. From a ridge above the Mlin cabin, I observed. The house appeared quiet. Smoke from the chimney curled lazily into the starless sky, but no movement came from the windows. The barn remained dark, a hulking silhouette against the snow. And then, as I adjusted my eyes, I saw the first signs of something unnatural. A subtle scrape in the earth near the well, planks that looked fresher than the rest of the structure, the smell of something disturbed in the cold air. Hours passed. My eyes traced the shadows of the trees, the angles of the cabin, the corners of the barn. Then, past midnight, the faintest glimmer of lamplight appeared in the barn, far enough to cast long, shifting shapes across the snow. I could hear the sound of metal against wood, slow and deliberate, each scrape like a heartbeat of some dark rhythm. And the voices came, low and controlled, words carried through the chinking of the cabin logs. Ezra Mlin, flat and worried. Virgil Mlin, calm, calculating, amused. He knows we'll bring others. Let him try. No law touches us out here. We've done this 8 years. No one stopped us. One more name to add to the count. I crouched behind the ridge, breath shallow, the cold no longer my enemy. My mind worked quickly, cataloguing every sound, every syllable, every clue. I knew then that the well, capped with fresh planks, held the evidence I could not yet bring forth, that the bodies of those women rested beneath stone and earth, silent witnesses to a cruelty beyond imagining. I did not move until the voices faded, and then, in the stillness of the hollow, I realized something essential. The ledger, the letters, the traces of movement, they had led me to the threshold of the truth. It was a threshold most men would not cross, but I had no choice. Someone had to see. Someone had to count the names. Someone had to follow the ink to the darkness. Before dawn, I returned to town, my coat stiff with frost, my mind racing. I made no announcements, spoke to no one. The ledger and the letters were my companions. And I began planning, carefully, deliberately, who could help me open that well, who could lift the cap from the place where evil had slept for so long. There would be no law, no justice, no reprieve, only action, because silence had already claimed too many lives. I made arrangements with Jacob Marsh, a strong, reliable man, accustomed to hard labor and harder truths. We would return together. The well would be opened. The truth would be brought into the light, no matter the cost. And as I lay awake that night, the voices of the brothers still echoing in the wind, I realized that once the ledger had led me here, there would be no turning back. The first light of dawn cut thinly through the trees as I returned to Piney Hollow, Jacob Marsh at my side, his breath steaming in the frozen air. The hollow was silent, the snow untouched except for our own tracks. The cabin appeared deserted, the barn looming dark and still. I knew the well was there, hidden beneath planks, holding secrets that had remained undisturbed for years. We approached carefully. Every step through the snow was deliberate, measured. I had brought a crowbar, and Jacob carried the strength of a man accustomed to earth and labor. Together, we worked to lift the planks, the iron stakes biting into frozen wood, protesting our intrusion. And then, at last, the last piece gave way. Darkness, cold, unnatural, and final. The air that rose from the well carried a scent that made my stomach tighten, a mixture of lime, rot, and something sweeter, something that spoke of lives extinguished and buried in the quiet of the valley. I struck a match, the flame trembling in my hand, and peered down into the shaft. Stone walls descended far below, 15 feet at least, and through the thin layer of white powder on the bottom, shapes began to emerge. Cloth, wool, cotton, dresses rotted and stained. And then, unmistakable human forms. A woman's hand, a glimpse of jewelry, a fragment of hair preserved in cold that had held it in place for years. My breath caught. Jacob stepped back, hands covering his mouth, eyes wide. I felt the ledger in my coat, letters pressed close, each name a voice now finally heard. We replaced the cap temporarily until the sheriff could arrive with proper equipment. And I waited, standing over that well, rifle across my knees, watching the cabin, the barn, the trees. The hollow held its breath with me. The brothers had fled, or perhaps slept, or perhaps believed themselves untouchable. But the ledger had caught them in the end, and the evidence spoke louder than their lies ever could. 2 hours later, Sheriff Hayes arrived with deputies, moving cautiously through snow that resisted every step. We reopened the well, confirming the horrors I had known, and the weight of it settled on every man present. Bodies, personal effects, letters tied in bundles, all catalogued meticulously by the same hands that had sent hope into the valley, only to have it return in absence. The journal, Virgil Mlin's careful records of each arrival, each disappearance, each death. It was a ledger of life extinguished, written in clinical, deliberate script. 8 women over 8 years. Every detail logged like merchandise. Every life catalogued, measured, and discarded. Sarah Dill, Constance Healy, Josephine Dale, Margaret Frost, Ada Kern, and 3 others whose names would now be added to the mourning of the county. I felt a strange calm then, as if the ledger, the letters, the cold earth of the well, had finally allowed the valley itself to speak. Justice, in the legal sense, had been absent for decades. But the land remembered, the ledger remembered, and someone, the one willing to see and act, had brought the truth into the light. The bodies were carefully removed, each garment, each piece of jewelry, each letter noted and preserved. Families would be notified, funerals held. Closure, though delayed, would finally arrive. And I understood something that day, standing in the snow, watching the hollow hold its secrets no longer. Evil survives when good men look away. But when even one man refuses, when one ledger is kept, when one pair of eyes does not blink, then silence can be broken, and the names remembered. The days that followed were bitter and relentless. Winter had tightened its grip on the Ozarks, snow and ice blanketing Piney Hollow, as if to mark the valley itself in mourning. The Mlin property, now stripped of its first layer of secrets, still held one final truth: the brothers themselves. 3 weeks passed with only false sightings, whispers of movement in the ridges and hollows. Then, on January 23rd, a trapper named Goss stumbled upon a limestone cave, 20 miles north of Piney Hollow. Inside, the Mlin brothers lay frozen, curled against the stone walls, bodies stiff and lifeless. Exposure had claimed them within hours, their escape halted by the merciless winter. No fire, no provisions, no chance of flight. Nature had delivered judgment when men refused to act. Among their frozen forms lay evidence that completed the ledger of horrors: Ada Kern's jewelry, letters, and Virgil's journal. The entries were precise, clinical, and horrifying. 8 women, 8 deaths, each life catalogued as though they were objects. The truth Silus had long suspected was now undeniable. The well at the Mlin property was fully excavated over the next week. 5 sets of remains were recovered, each carefully catalogued, identified through personal effects and dental records, and returned to families who had mourned in silence for years. Funerals were held at the Methodist Church, the valley echoing with grief and remembrance. At Ada Kern's service, her father read her final letter aloud, words of hope and trust that had survived even death. Silus stood at the back, silent, the ledger of lives held firmly in his mind. The county ordered the Mlin property burned in March. Every tool, every trap, every structure was doused in lamp oil and set aflame. Smoke rose into the grey sky, carrying with it a reckoning that the law had failed to deliver. The hollow itself seemed to exhale, releasing the weight of its secrets into the cold wind. Silus Webb returned to his post as postmaster, a man who had carried the ledger of lives, the letters of hope, and the truth of human evil alone. He never married. He never spoke publicly of the Mlin case except when duty demanded it. On the day the property burned, he updated his personal journal one final time. His words were simple, deliberate, and unwavering. Case closed. Justice served. Let the record stand. Evil hides in quiet places, but the land remembers, and someone is always keeping the books. And so, Piney Hollow returned to silence. The valley, the forests, the hills, each carried the memory of the women who had been stolen, and the man who refused to look away. Their names, once forgotten, were now written in the ledger of history. And the lesson lingered long after. Even in the quietest places, where shadows gather and no one watches, truth waits for those willing to keep the books, to see, and to act.